I'm going to talk today about a number of my projects. And in terms of, before I jump in, first I just want to acknowledge like my research team listed here, some of them, many others past and present here that have worked on my project, my collaborators, David Hutton's a longtime collaborator of mine on vaccine economics at School of Public Health, Kevin Domkowski, who's traveling today. We co-lead the current phase of the joint initiative in vaccine economics, and many other collaborators along the way. But as I was putting this slide together, I really wanted to start with this because I think the work that we all do is a team sport, and that none of us can do the work that we do without the phenomenal research team and members and collaborators that we have. So I want to start with this slide and just thank everyone who's been a part of my research over the many years. And interestingly, for those of you that are earlier in your career, that I was putting together this list of collaborators, I realized that many of these folks I have now been collaborating with for more than 10 years. And some of them, actually, Eve Wittenberg, who is a very, very close friend and collaborator of mine, we were grad students together, and we've now been collaborating for more than 20 years. And so kind of look around at who your collaborators are now, because you may be working with these people for many, many years to come. And that has been a really, really gratifying part of my career. So I wanted to start with my personal mission statement that guides all of my research. And so my goal is to inform clinical and policy decisions using methods of decision science and economic evaluation. I will often introduce myself as a health economist because that's easier and it's very short and people have kind of an understanding of what that is. But really, at the end of the day, I'm a decision scientist. That my PhD is in health policy and decision sciences. I use a lot of economics in my research because often we need that to make effective decisions, especially when we're talking about public policy recommendations. But at the end of the day, I'm really a decision scientist at heart, and you'll see that at the theme of the research that I present today. So for today, I'm going to talk about just touch on the three main areas of my research. So cost effectiveness analysis, decision analysis, and valuing health outcomes, give an example of each. I have way too many slides because I'm always very excited to talk about my research, so I'm going to signal now that this second section on newborn screening, depending how the timing's going, I may just skip it entirely, but I'm always happy to talk about that offline if you would like. And as most of you know, I really hate to lecture, so please feel free to jump in and ask questions along the way. I hope we'll have more discussion. Okay. Transfer of information this morning. All right, so I'm going to start. The next few slides are going to be a quick primer on economic evaluation. Some of you will have seen this before, so you can tune out for the next 5 minutes, but for those of you that haven't, I think it's really important to start with the basics of cost effectiveness analysis. So CEA is a type of economic evaluation. It compares the relative costs and outcomes of two or more alternatives. Just remember, I'm only interested if we're making a decision, so there's got to be at least two choices that we're thinking about. And it can be used by decision makers to assist with both resource allocation and policy decisions. There are four main types of economic evaluation: a cost analysis, a cost effectiveness analysis, a cost utility analysis, which is really just a special case of cost effectiveness analysis, and cost benefit analysis. For the measurement of costs, we're measuring these in monetary units. Some of the costs that we're measuring are not actually paid for with cash, but may include things like time costs. So if we're thinking of a parent taking a child to the pediatrician's office, there is time for that parent. We call that a time cost. So if it's 2 hours to take the kid to the pediatrician, we'll count that time and cost it out using an average hourly wage rate so that we can include it in the economic evaluation. I'm going to run through these really quickly. I'm always happy to talk in more detail about economic evaluation and always happy to send references to. I have a core set of references that include the basics of economic evaluation if anyone is ever interested in those. So we're measuring costs because we want to be able to understand what the total investment is in a new intervention or an existing intervention. But the measurement of health consequences will differ across these different types of analyses. So for cost analysis, we're just measuring costs. We're not looking at health outcomes. This is almost never the correct type of economic evaluation to use. So when you're reading in the literature that there's a cost analysis that is reporting what type of intervention reports in the lowest costs and is advocating for that intervention, you should pause and say, like, is there any difference in health outcomes here? Because if the health outcomes are different and the health costs are different, you can't just look at the health costs because you're missing what additional health you might be purchasing with that additional investment in resources. So typically in my research, I'm using either cost effectiveness analysis or cost utility analysis. For cost effectiveness analysis, we're looking at measuring health consequences in natural units. Those could be deaths averted, hospitalizations averted. So the metric would be the cost per event averted. Cost utility analysis, we're translating all of our health outcomes into, we're assigning health utilities. A health utility is a weight that we put on a health state. Everything gets rated on 0 to 1. 0 is equivalent to being dead. 1 is equivalent to perfect health. Everything else gets a weight in between that. Although some health states are worse than being dead, and we can assign negative numbers to those health states. And then we weight everything by how long is spent in the state, and we use a metric called quality-adjusted life years. So a quality-adjusted life year is essentially equivalent to spending a year in perfect health. And so we can look at what the differences are across different interventions. So if we just run through this thinking about in the context of vaccines. So, yeah.
What is perfect health?
Perfect health. What do you think was perfect health?
I've never seen a doctor using it.
It is the best health that you can imagine being in. Most of us are not in perfect health.
Does it
So
mean $0 used in?
It has nothing to do with dollars. We're just thinking about health. So that's where, so hopefully that'll become a little bit clearer when we go through an example, but let's come back to that in a few slides at the end of the Zoster example. That's a great question. So in terms of thinking about this in terms of vaccination, so let's think about influenza vaccination. So we have, a number of years ago, although off the market, actually he's back on the market now, the live attenuated influenza vaccine. So we have 2 formulations of flu vaccine. One is inactivated, one is intranasal. They have different levels of effectiveness, they have different side effects, they have different costs. So if we just did a cost analysis looking at minimizing costs, the inactivated vaccine is much cheaper than the live attenuated vaccine. In the initial studies that came out, and there's actually mixed evidence now, but the initial studies that came out show that live attenuated influenza vaccine was more effective than the injectable vaccine. It was also more expensive. So if we looked at just a cost analysis, the intervention with the lower cost would be the injectable vaccine, but then we're completely ignoring the additional effectiveness of the intranasal vaccine. So that is not the appropriate analysis to use. So there we use cost effectiveness analysis, again, where we could look at intermediate health states, the cost per influenza episode averted, cost per hospitalization averted. What quality adjusted life years allow us to do is to bundle all of those health endpoints into a single metric. There are limitations to that. We won't get into that today. That's for the advanced methods course that we can hopefully have, actually maybe in our methods seminar later this year. But getting back to the cost analysis, so there are some cases where it will be appropriate to do a cost analysis without looking at the health outcome. One example would be if we're looking at delivery settings for influenza vaccine. So let's assume that only the injectable flu vaccine is available, as it has been for the last couple of years, and we're simply thinking about what is the best setting. So looking at the traditional physician office setting, or streamlined settings such as clinics in the employer, at the employer setting, or in the pharmacy setting. And so for those different settings, there would be different costs of administration of vaccination, that it's actually much less efficient to give a flu vaccine in the physician office setting because there are all the overhead costs that you have to allocate to vaccination as well. Whereas in a more streamlined, employer-based setting, that they're, we have them in the conference room here, they're really low overhead. There's a nurse that's delivering that. And so there, it would actually be appropriate to do a cost analysis. We know that the outcomes of the vaccination will be exactly the same, so it's be exactly the same vaccine delivered across those different settings, but the costs are lower in some settings than others, so there we can do a cost. But usually not. Usually there's a difference in health outcomes. So just keep that in mind whenever you're reading economic valuations in your spare time. So this is the nuts and bolts of what we do. We're looking at incremental costs of, in this case, vaccination compared to no vaccination. What happens, hospitalizations, deaths, all of the direct medical costs, all of the time costs associated with that, and then looking at the quality adjusted life years. And again, this includes both the health benefits, so averted hospitalizations, averted flu episodes. It will also include some costs on the health side. So there are adverse events associated with vaccination. So if people feel sick, for kids, we know there's a regular incidence of influenza-like symptoms. Some of those kids will be brought into the pediatrician's office, so there may be both time costs and direct medical costs associated with those. We'll include all of those in the analysis. And then we're looking at the relative cost effectiveness, comparing those two. I'm going to go through a couple of misconceptions, so we can just get those out of the way, and then you can correct people when you hear other people saying them. So cost effective does not mean cost saving. We are always thinking about how much health we're buying for that additional investment in resources, money, and time, and other resources usually. There are very few interventions that are actually cost saving. Almost everything that we do in medical care much of it is cost effective. Some of it's not cost effective, but almost none of it's cost. I have an example slide here in the vaccination context. This is what we call a league table that shows a number of different vaccines, the different cost effectiveness ratios associated with them. So these range, we do actually have cost saving for rotavirus. I'm ranging all the way up to $138,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. So the question that you may be thinking is, well, how do we decide what's cost or not? So in this country, we do not have a specific cost effectiveness threshold to determine whether or not something's cost effective. In other countries like the UK, they do use a very strict cost effectiveness threshold, 30,000 pounds per quality adjusted life year when they are evaluating new interventions for use in their national system. Here, the threshold is higher. Again, we don't have a strict threshold, but it's probably somewhere in the $100,000 to $150,000 per quality adjusted life year range. And so keep that in mind when we walk through some of the additional examples. Yes?
So I've heard some people say that we should use the UK threshold. My response to that is always that our prices are so much higher. Mm-hmm. So how do you standardize with that? Mm-hmm. You have to kind of, some power parity or something like that.
So the question is, we should have a longer conversation about this, but the question is, like, where does that threshold come from in the UK? And there is actually no clear theoretical justification for that threshold. There is a theoretical justification for actually a slightly higher threshold here in the US, $150,000 to $200,000 per quality adjusted life year, which uses value the statistical life data. So, what the value that people have placed that we can that we've observed from revealed preference studies on the value of saving a life. And if we translate that back into qualities, it's about 150 to 200. So it might be a little bit higher than this. So I'm not convinced by that argument that we should be using here. Also, our investment in health is much higher in the United States. So kind of as a society, we have collectively, I'm not sure agreed is the right word, but we are collectively investing much more of our GDP in health than in the UK. So that would also argue for a higher threshold. I mean, the question is that where we want to be?
Yeah,
but that's a longer
yeah.
question. Another common misconception is that all preventive interventions are cost-saving or cost-effective. The data do not show that to be true. So that, and especially for screening interventions, that it's important to consider that there are screening costs at the population level for identifying a relatively small number of individuals with that particular condition. And so even though the screening cost per person might be quite low, that collectively across the population, that can be an enormous investment from a societal perspective. So this slide shows from a database of published cost effectiveness analyses. If we divide everything into prevention or treatment, the distribution of cost effectiveness ratios. And what you can see here is that it looks pretty similar. So we've got preventive interventions in the dark green, light green interventions are treatment, active treatment interventions. The distribution looks pretty similar across cost effectiveness categories. We have about 20% of kind of all interventions. Again, there is some publication bias. These are studies that have been published that have shown to be cost saving, but it's pretty similar across preventive and treatment interventions. And the rest of the distribution looks. So prevention does not equal cost savings. Prevention does not necessarily equal cost effective. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about CDC and their use of economic evaluation. Questions here? So. Okay. All right, so the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices is the decision-making body that makes recommendations on behalf of the CDC. It is a body of 15 voting members that are appointed by the CDC, but they are not CDC employees. They're actually an independent organization. What is exciting for people like me is that this is one of the very few places in the United States where cost effectiveness analysis is explicitly used as part of the decision-making process. And this has been true since the 1980s when they formed the ACIP. This is part of their original charter. So there's an evidence review process. Whenever there's a new vaccine in development, the CDC, about 18 to 24 months beforehand, will start an evidence review process. They'll look at evidence within these categories here: disease burden, vaccine safety, vaccine effectiveness, economic evaluation, and impact on providers. And so how this vaccine, if there are special considerations in terms of administration, part of the decision-making process as well. This is a public process when they have ACIP meetings 3 times a year. The data and information are all presented publicly. It's presented by webinar live as well. There is a public comment part of the of each of the meetings, so anybody can register beforehand to provide public comment during these meetings. And so we will often hear during those meetings from groups and individuals opposed to vaccination, as well as pharmaceutical manufacturers who are kind of advocating for their vaccines. Those are kind of the 2 main camps that we hear in those public comments. And then there's a vote. The deliberations of the committee are also public. And then everything is available afterwards online, so you could go online right now and look at the last ACIP meeting, download the whole thing if you wanted to. But some of it is actually quite interesting. So we talked about this slide before. I'm going to skip over that. In terms of my research with the CDC, I've been really fortunate to be involved with the Joint Initiative in Vaccine Economics, which was originally led by my very first faculty mentor, Tracy Liu, when I was at Harvard, and now I've been leading for the last 10 years with David Hutton and now with Kevin Domkowski. So this has been a cooperative agreement. It's renewed every 3 years. It's a competitive renewal. Within each of those grant proposals, we typically include 3 different projects. And so we've published more than 20, I didn't go back and count, it's probably more than 30 actually, papers over the last 19 years. Some of the vaccines that we've evaluated are routine influenza vaccination, so looking at the expansion during the early 2000s when recommendations for influenza vaccine were first extended to healthy children under 5, and then was expanded to healthy school-age children. We worked with them on the economic evaluation. We did work on H1N1 vaccination, herpes zoster. We're now working on an RSV vaccine. It looks like there is likely to be an RSV vaccine, not for kids yet, but for adults. Looks like it's coming out in 2 years. And those are still in clinical trials, but they're in phase 3 trials at this point. The methods that we use are cost-effectiveness analysis, health utility evaluation. So we will do separate studies to assign those numbers to the different health states so that we can plug those into our simulation model. Conjoint analysis, and we've done some qualitative research as well when we really want to understand what's happening in terms of decision making. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a quick case study of the herpes zoster vaccine analysis that we did 2 years ago for the new Shingrix vaccine that is now out and recommended for all individuals aged 50 and older. And happy to answer questions too about those of us that may fit into that age group if you're thinking about that vaccine. So these were the 3 policy questions on the table for the ACIP to consider. Should the ACIP recommend HCSU, and that was the name of the vaccine before it was branded, and actually I don't typically use branded names in any of my presentations, but we'll sometimes throw them in so that people are familiar with them. For vaccination of immunocompetent adults. So we weren't looking at immunocompromised, and actually that question is coming to the ACIP now as to whether or not the recommendation will be expanded to immunocompromised individuals. Yeah, go ahead.
For that question of immunocompromised, because for the next round of
I know it includes younger adults. No, I don't think it includes children. I don't think they've done any studies in kids. What?
we need to.
Yeah, I don't think they've
offline.
done any studies in kids. That's a great question. Yeah, we should talk offline.
I agree with you.
I think a few of us.
Yeah. So, let's talk offline. That's a great question. So the second policy question was, should ACIP recommend HCSU for individuals previously vaccinated with ZVL, Zoster Vaccine Live? So there was already a herpes zoster vaccine on the market for about 8 years before this new vaccine was approved by the FDA. That vaccine was not very effective, maybe about 60 to 70% effective in the first year, and then it waned pretty quickly over about 6 years. And so the uptake of that vaccine was very low, fewer than 10% of all adults, and that vaccine was actually only recommended for 60 and older. Very few adults were actually vaccinated, but the question was for those that had already received this vaccine, should they get HCSU? The third question was, should ACIP make a preferential recommendation for HCSU over Z? So when the recommendation comes out, should they just say, this vaccine is now recommended, or should they say this vaccine is recommended and ZVL is no longer recommended? And for the ACIP, this was a big deal because they have never before considered a preferential recommendation for a new vaccine. But because this new vaccine was so much more effective, close to 100% effective compared to the existing vaccine, there's a lot of discussion as to whether they needed to make. Yeah.
Did they do that to the acellular?
They did. I thought they approved it and they made a preferential recommendation the following year.
Oh, I see. So, do they ever do like a two-tier thing, like for compliments?
Yes. Yes, they do. They often have tiers of recommendations, and actually, the two vaccines here, CBL is recommended for 60 and older, but the effectiveness evidence is not very compelling for 50 to 59, so it's not actually recommended for 50 to 59, but it is approved by the FDA for 50 to 59. So so there can be differences in the approval compared to the CDC. All right, questions? Okay, great. So we created a simulation model. The backbone of all the simulation models are decision analysis. So we are, again, there has to be one or more interventions. Here we're comparing the new vaccine compared to the old vaccine, compared to no vaccination. We're comparing all of those together. We then have the complication with the new vaccine. It is a 2-dose recommended protocol. However, in practice, we know that it's very likely that not every person will get both recommended doses, and that 1-dose administration comes, not surprisingly, with lower effectiveness. So we wanted to include that in the model as well. So we have a branch there as well. This is a very simplified schematic of our disease simulation model. So in any year, somebody can remain disease-free. They can experience an episode of herpes zoster. If they have herpes zoster, it can be uncomplicated. They can have post-herpetic neuralgia. They can have ocular complications or other complications. Very small number of people die due to complications of herpes zoster, but we include that in the model as well. People can die, from other natural causes at any point within the model. Each of these arrows in the model is represented by a probability that we develop using evidence in the literature or primary data either that we collected or use secondary sources to estimate. And then each of these health states will be assigned, is assigned a health utility weight. So somewhere between 0 and 1. If, for individuals in the model that die, they get 0 QALYs from that point on in the model. We then simulate patients throughout the lifetime until they've all died. So here we're simulating patients ages 50 and older, but we've divided them into 10-year groupings because we knew that the CDC would be interested in how the effectiveness and cost effectiveness vary by age group, because the effectiveness also varies a little bit by age group for the vaccine. So I'm going to skip to the results. So I'm here, Sean, probably having a flashback to this model. So one other thing I will say is because I'm really interested in real policy decisions, that often our projects have real deadlines that other research studies don't usually have. And so again, a huge shout out to my team who has worked for many of these deadlines. For this one in particular, we were getting information from the CDC very late in the game, and this was when I got to Atlanta the night before. There's also this whole political process that's happening. We met at the hotel with my CDC collaborators, and we actually rewrote all the slides until 2 in the morning, and then we got up and presented to CDC because. Again, this is a public process, so there has to be really careful attention to how we're framing all of the results. So these are our basic results. As you can see, there is variation by age in terms of cost effectiveness that we see slightly higher cost effectiveness, which again means less favorable in terms of the cost effectiveness results, and it's most cost effective in 80 to 89-year-olds. We see that going up a little bit for the highest age group, primarily because if you're getting vaccinated when you're 90 years old, your life expectancy is very small. So you're not going to be able to utilize the full benefits of that vaccination. If we look at this as a group, it's about $31,000 per quality adjusted life year. So back to thinking about the threshold. So our answer to question 1 is it looks pretty cost effective, across all age groups.
Where did you get the inputs from, like the probability of death? The inputs from SME?
Yeah. So the evidence for the incidence rates, so typically for each of these branches, we do a systematic literature review. So we go through the review, we're evaluating all of the eligible papers. I would say it's not quite a grade process that we do because some of the studies, we have to pay attention to how closely they match our modeled population. So we may toss some studies out because of that, but pretty close to a grade process. We use the best evidence we can, and then we'll be combining studies to get those incidence rates. And again, one comment, and you'll see this in a minute, we'll talk about the probabilistic results, but in the model, we also appreciate that there's uncertainty around these modeling parameters. So every parameter in the model is represented not by a single point estimate, but by a distribution. And then we do many, many simulations pulling from that distribution. And so this slide, these are the mean incremental cost effectiveness ratios, but there are confidence intervals around each of these numbers. Your second question is around where did we get the health utility rates? Well, interestingly, we had done a study for CDC about 10 years ago. They had an idea that this might be on the horizon. So as one of our earlier JIVE studies, we had done a health utility assessment. And so we had nationally representative data, both for community ratings for health utilities as well as patient ratings. And so important to know, this reflects the community ratings. When we use the patient ratings, they actually look pretty similar. Sometimes they look different when we have patient values, but in this case.
You mean essentially that those are the questions where you're like, would you rather live 1 year with post-traumatic versus give up some number of years of your life?
Actually, really simple question. Yeah, so we use an approach called, for this one, we use time trade-off, where we present different scenarios for a community set of respondents. We will structure the questions. They'll get, typically these are online surveys. We give them background about the disease. We give them background about the types of questions we're asking. And then we set up using a structured experimental design. How much time would you be willing to give up from the end of your life to avoid living in this particular health state? And then we would describe either ocular complications or herpes zoster. It's a little bit more complicated for temporary health states, which we have here, but there are some established methods for that.
For children who ask them.
Yeah, so, well, if we're using a sample of community respondents, those are all comers. We ask people to imagine a child that they know with that health state. For the patient values, we would ask the parents of a child who had experienced the complications. And that adds complications as well, but we've done a lot of that as well. All right, so these are sensitivity analysis. Again, like each of these parameters, we have uncertainty, and so these are how the results change when we vary in one-way sensitivity analysis individual parameters across a range of plausible values. Most sensitive, not surprisingly, to assumptions around vaccine effectiveness, and we've bundled in here assumptions around the effectiveness of the one dose as well as for 2 doses, because we know some proportion will only be getting 1 dose. But even so, still with under the $100,000 kind of rough threshold for cost effectiveness. The revaccination scenario, so here we used our model, ask the question, what is the incremental cost effectiveness for vaccination with HCSU in a patient who has already received Zoster vaccine live? And so there what we did is we did kind of a estimation of the incremental effectiveness, so using the difference between the effectiveness of the CBL, depending when they were vaccinated, and the effectiveness, the waning rate. Remember, these are both waning over time for HCSU, and applied that to the different age groups. Here, there was a question, they wanted to know, well, what if somebody just got vaccinated yesterday? Should they get vaccinated today now that HCSU is approved? They had gotten the old vaccine. So that's our immediate revaccination scenario. And these are the different age groups across the bottom, and still looks pretty cost effective, except maybe kind of in that youngest age group. But then if we look at patients that have been vaccinated anywhere from 1 year to 5 years ago for the Zoster vaccine live, the economic evidence is pretty consistent with the recommendation for revaccination. For the third question, this was the question around a preferential recommendation. So if we use our simulation model to evaluate what the, over 10,000 simulations, what the incremental cost effectiveness is, because there are some simulations which you can imagine as you're drawing from those distributions that the vaccine effectiveness, we've got a confidence interval for the old vaccine, one draw we could get high vaccine effectiveness, and we've got a confidence interval around the newer vaccine, we could get a lower vaccine effectiveness, so that ratio is likely to look different from our average numbers. But looking across these different age groups, even when we assume that there's lower 2-dose completion, that the incremental cost effectiveness ratios still look very favorable. What I haven't shown here is our cost effectiveness acceptability curve. So that's where we look at the simulations to see, in what proportion of simulations, just looking at effectiveness, is HCSU more effective than CBL. And in those, more than 98% of the simulations, HCSU effective and cost effective than Zoster vaccine live. So just from the economic perspective, the results would be consistent with preferential recommendation. And I say that specifically from the economic perspective. So let's talk about what the ACIP decided. So this was actually fascinating from a policy perspective. So this deliberation, where you have to be a little bit policy geek, but I think we all are here. So at the ACIP on this day, they have like a very strict agenda for these ACIP. And so, there was 45 minutes on the agenda for, presentation of the effectiveness evidence. There was 20 minutes for the economic report, which I gave. There were questions from the committee. And then there was 45 minutes on the agenda for discussion and vote. That discussion ended up going more than 2 hours. And people that I know at the CDC, who typically are watching on the live by webinar, said they were glued to their screen. It was fascinating. So the first question went pretty quickly. Should ACIP recommend HCSU for vaccination of immunocompetent adults 50 years and older? That went pretty quickly. The vote was unanimous, 15-0. The second question, should ACIP recommend HCSU for individuals previously vaccinated with CBL? There was a lot of discussion. People were concerned that there were subgroups that were not represented clearly, minority groups within the clinical trials, and that it may be a little bit premature to make this recommendation. And so there were concerns, but that discussion still went pretty quickly, but the vote was not unanimous. It was 12-3. When we got to the third question, this is where the debate went on for almost 2 hours. So there were ACIP members that felt very strongly that this was a situation where the average primary care provider would not necessarily know the details between the two types of vaccines, and that it would be crucially important for the CDC to make this preferential recommendation to make sure that patients were directed as quickly as possible to the new vaccine. There were other ACIP members that felt just as strongly. On the other hand, that there were concerns, and we've seen this before with other vaccines, that there are clinical trials that have been conducted on, a few hundred patients. And here, these were actually large multinational clinical trials, but the total sample size across all those trials was probably about 2,000 patients. And so sometimes when you start to vaccinate across a population, adverse events come up. And we've seen this in the rotavirus vaccine, we've seen for other types of interventions. There was a lot of concern on the ACIP that once this was rolled out population-wide, that there might be an adverse event that was not detected in the clinical trial that we should be concerned about. There were concerns about supply. We've also seen this in the past. They said, well, what if we roll this out and there are shortages in supply for HCSU, and then essentially if we make a preferential recommendation, it will, and it has, knocked the existing vaccine out of the market because the manufacturer is not likely to continue producing that vaccine, and then we'll have massive shortages of the new vaccine and nothing else to vaccinate people with. Even though it's not a great vaccine, at least it's available. Strong arguments on both sides. It went on for multiple hours. When they finally took the vote, you could see it was incredibly close, 8-7. This was the closest vote that the ACIP has had in their history of the ACIP. And it was also interesting from a policy perspective, to keep in mind, there are, other implications as well, because after this, really divisive discussion, there's actually a lot of concern on part of the ACIP, are we kind of okay as a group? And so they actually spent some time, in their next closed meeting, kind of processing through that because they were concerned that there would be, dissension among the group. And this is a group that works really, really closely together and be working with all of us. So that is the exciting case study of HCSU. Yeah, sure.
Does the ACIP have the ability when they make a recommendation to also then they'll have the data?
Yes, and that is what they have done in every single case in the past, is that they've never made a preferential recommendation at the time of approval, but they have made a recommendation, and then either 1 or 2 years later, then they've made the preferential. And that's what a lot of people are arguing for, those 7. Yeah.
So is Merck the maker of Zostavax or is Shingrix? Zostavax. Okay.
Yeah.
So Merck was basically knocked out of the market, right? So obviously they're not happy. One, I'm curious, how did they criticize your simulation? Did they? I assume they did.
My simulation. Yeah.
And then 2 is, how does ACIP protect against injury? A lot of ongoing kind of.
Those are great
debates,
questions.
right?
So what I didn't include here, I should have pulled this slide in because it's a really good one. But I'll send it to you later, Cal, because you'll be interested. So during the deliberation, working up to the main ACIP meeting, there's a Zoster working group that includes some ACIP members. I'm on it. There are 30 people from across the country that are involved either in the epidemiology of Zoster. And so we work to evaluate the evidence and create a report that goes to the ACIP. Manufacturers can present both confidential clinical trial data to that group along the way. So I had access to some confidential data that I could use in my model. Manufacturers are open to submitting their own economic models, which they did in this case. So both GSK, who makes HCR, both submitted their own economic models, and we evaluated those along the way. And the Zoster working group can provide feedback on those models. So actually, as we saw those coming through, I would say the critique was not to our model, but was to their model. Like, you have not provided any rationale for this, confidence interval that they're using. If some of their, and you see this not just for vaccines, but say there's a confidence interval within the clinical trial for effectiveness from 0.6 to 0.8, and they've selected 0.8 as the base case effectiveness for their simulation. And so those are areas that we would provide feedback to along the way and ask them to go back and rerun. But so there is either a CDC economist, in this case, I played the role of the CDC economist, and I evaluated all three models head to head. So I had a series of slides in which summarized the differences in input assumptions across the three models. Not surprisingly, the HCSU performed much better in the GSK model, and CVL did not look good. We saw the reverse in the Merck analysis, and our analysis is like almost exactly in the middle. So as I thought, I'm not going to get to newborn screening, but I do want to finish up with a few minutes on family spillover effects. And in this area of my research, I use a number of different methodologies, and I'm happy to use any methodology that answers the research question that we are asking. Again, typically within economics and decision sciences. So we use health utility evaluation, conjoint analysis, and over the last 10 years, I've become increasingly interested in families. I think this is a crucial area when we're thinking about pediatric cost effectiveness analysis, that it's been gaining attention in recent years. I'm really happy to see, but when we're talking about healthcare for children, that if we're not taking into account effects on the family in terms of time costs, in terms of quality of life effects, we're missing the full burden of disease. And then when we're looking to value an intervention, we're then missing the full value of what we're buying for that additional investment. So this slide just shows you some of the burden for informal caregiving, which is enormous. So if we look at the number of caregivers for someone who's ill, it's 29% of all adults. I'm sure here in this room, like, we all have stories that we can share, both for our kids, our parents, and others in our family. If we just cost out time, this is informal caregiver time that is not being reimbursed by anyone. That totals up to about $450 billion per year. The mean duration of caregiving is about 4.6 years for elderly, and that for individuals 18 years of younger, about 30 hours per week on average. And so if we think about this conceptually, we can put those costs into three broad buckets. So one are direct medical costs. And so we, in terms of measuring family spillover, there are a lot of costs that are not covered by insurance, that are borne by the family, even for routine interventions. But then for disabled individuals, you can think of things like modifications to the structure of a home to accommodate a wheelchair. All kinds of durable medical equipment is not covered or not covered adequately. All those costs go to the family level. So those are direct medical costs. Those are pretty easy to identify and to measure and quantify. The next category are time costs for informal caregiving. It's an area that has received increasing attention over the last 5 to 7 years. It is less easy to quantify because sometimes, especially if we're thinking about very young children who are ill, that there is, if you think of an infant, that there is care. I mean, we need to be cared for 24/7 anyway. So how do you think about an incremental time cost for those children? So there are questions that have not yet been fully specified, but can be captured in part by the third category, which is health and quality of life effects for caregivers and other family members. So here, if we're thinking about an infant with a complex chronic illness if we look at the informal care time, we may not see a difference because infants require round-the-clock care as well. But where we will see a difference is both in health effects and quality of life effects for informal caregivers. That there are studies, and we've done some of this work, that we can see a change measured using quality of life instruments for caregivers, informal caregivers. What we have also shown is that there can be quality of life effects just as high for other family members. So a caring effect as opposed to a caregiver effect for having an ill member of the family. And that we want to be able to capture. We can include it in our and in our economic evaluations as a cost of illness. We've done qualitative work before to inform our quantitative work in this area. I think what's important to note here is that from the economic perspective, typically we're talking very narrowly about health-related quality of life. The challenge here is that many of the demands that we see are non-health areas. And just to give a specific example, that for when we're measuring quantitatively changes in quality of life, that there are larger effects for looking at a spouse that's caring for an ill spouse, that for dementia compared to even cancer, that for conditions where the spouse or family member loses that ability to interact with their family member, that is a huge loss in quality of life, much more than the informal caregiving effect, and that they're helping them with activities. So kind of the interruption of that relationship is much more impactful. And so that's different than what we're usually thinking about for health-related quality. So there's research to measure that. When we think about this in the context of cost effectiveness analysis, the question is, how wide do we draw that circle? If we're talking about kids, should we just be including parents' loss in quality of life? Should we be including siblings as well? Should we be drawing the circle wider? Should we be including teachers as well? There are studies that have shown that having students with ADHD in their class actually impacts a teacher's quality of life, and so we can include those as well. These questions remain to be answered. There's a lot of work here. If anybody's interested, let me know. We can talk more. And then there could be some double counting. So this question back to Sabine's question around, are we using parent proxies to value child health? When we use parent proxies, there's some emerging evidence that they may be already including some of that impact on their own health when they report that value to child health. So how do we take care of that and avoiding any double counting there? So going back to the beginning, my friend and colleague Eve Wittenberg and I just collaborated on guest editing a special issue on pharmacoeconomics, looking at some of these questions, and I think there's a really nice paper in there that spells out these questions around like how wide we draw the circle. That's going to be an important conceptual framing going forward. Then I just want to finish by talking about some of my ongoing work in these areas. So right now, as I mentioned, we're developing a model. We're doing a health utility study. We're also collecting data on family level costs associated with RSV illness. Didn't talk about newborn screening, so I'm going to skip that. Going forward for family spillover effects, the two areas that we're working on right now is the first is developing a core outcome set for measuring family spillover. So if for the clinical trial setting, for a registry, can we identify a set of 10 core items, but a core set of items that can be included in that trial that will capture not everything, but the majority of family spillover effects. So we're just starting that work now. We're going to be following the COMET process for developing that outcome set, and you'll probably be hearing from us at some point because we're looking for very wide stakeholder engagement for that process. And then the final thing that I'll end with is we're creating a health utility evaluation set. We're calling it the PEDS-UTIL for the PEDS-QALY. So the PEDS-QALY is a commonly used quality of life instrument for child health, often used in clinical trials. we're planning to create a health utility evaluation set so that a health utility weight can be estimated directly from this PEDS-QL data without additional data collection, so without having to go and do a separate time trade-off survey endpoints. Okay, thank you for listening. Happy to answer any questions.